going to be chapter 28. It's part 2, so there are going to be 3 parts. The first part we went through male reproductive system, and then this will be the female reproductive system, and then we'll end with fertilization. Then we'll talk a little bit about hormonal birth control and a few other things, and that'll be all in part 3. So for this one, we're going to talk about female reproductive anatomy, meiosis, and oocyte production. So where in males we were producing sperm, in females we will be producing oocyte, or eggs, as we often call them. And then we'll talk about the different hormones, so gonadotropin-releasing hormone, follicle-stimulating hormone, luteinizing hormone. So we saw all these in males as well, and whereas in males we saw testosterone, in females we see estrogen, or estradiol, and then progesterone, and also we saw inhibin a little bit in males, and we'll talk a little tiny bit about it here with females as well. Okay, so usually we know that the reproductive system of females is cyclical, and really there are 2 things going on. There are 2 kind of different cycles. Of course, they're going on at the same time and they depend on each other, but there's the ovarian cycle, which is taking place in, of course, the ovaries, and the uterine cycle, which is taking place in the uterus. Okay, so the ovarian cycle is where the oocyte is going to develop, and then ovulation takes place and it leaves. Well, in the uterus you have the buildup of this endometrium inside the uterus, and it will then slough off. That's menses, and then it builds back up again. That's proliferative, and then it's there and ready to sustain a developing embryo if fertilization takes place, and that's the secretive. So ovarian cycle is follicular ovulation, then luteal, and so we're going to go through each of those and talk about the details of what that means. Okay, so first of all, a little bit on the anatomy. The ovaries, so there are 2 ovaries, and they sit in the lower abdominal region off to the sides, and that's where the egg, or the oocyte, actually develops. So that's where that's taking place, and that's the main thing with the ovaries, and that's also where hormones like estrogen and progesterone are produced. But that's where the egg is developing, and then that egg can leave the ovary, and that's ovulation, and it will move into the fallopian tubes, or the uterine tubes, and that egg will then travel down the fallopian tube, and if there's a sperm nearby, so if there happens to be sperm in the area, then they can fertilize that oocyte. Okay, but either way, the egg continues its journey down, and then if it's fertilized, it will implant in we used this term earlier, the endometrium, or there's a blood and cell lining that's kind of along the uterus here, and the fertilized oocyte, or the egg, will implant into this, and that's where it will grow if a pregnancy occurs. Okay, so going from the other side, now if this were a baby, the baby would develop and it would grow into a baby, and then it would have to pass out through the cervix and through the vagina. Now this is also how the sperm enters during fertilization. The sperm would move up, so it's deposited here in the vagina. Okay, this is a giant sperm, so you can see it. But the sperm will start out here in the vagina, and then it will move through the cervix. Now the cervix, most of the time actually, is sort of sealed off. Not really sealed, but there's some thick mucus that sperm can't move through this. So the sperm kind of gets rejected most of the time, except a little while before and after ovulation. And so in that case, this mucus plug, as it's called, will thin, and the sperm's able to move up, and then, like I said, it moves up into the fallopian tube through the uterus, and fertilization takes place. Okay, so back to in case there's a pregnancy, and sorry to be jumping around like this, we're going to talk about each of these individually though. So if the baby develops, then the baby will also have to pass through the cervix. And now we talk about the cervix as, I don't know if you've ever witnessed a birth or have had a child or even watched it on TV, you hear about dilated. How far along are you? How dilated are you? And this is where we're talking about the cervix, because the cervix, which again means neck, this neck of the uterus will start to dilate. The baby's head will start pushing on it, and it will start to stretch, and it will dilate. And when it's at about 10 centimeters, or which is 10 centimeters is about 4 inches, if that's more familiar to you, once it's about there, that's usually the sign that the baby is coming. Okay, that the baby will then start to push out. Okay. So our next, just screwed everything up over here. So our next thing that we're going to talk about is oogenesis. So remember, in males, after puberty, they started producing sperm. Well, and it basically, when you produce sperm, it goes through a process called meiosis, okay, where you take a diploid, or you have the 46 chromosomes, and that goes through a couple of different processes where it ends up ultimately forming 4 sperm. Okay, so that's what we saw with sperm, and now we're going to talk about what happens with egg development. So it's a little bit different, and I don't know, the main things that you should know the difference is that, first of all, what I have highlighted here, meiosis in females begins before birth. So that means that most of the eggs, or all of the eggs that will ever be produced, start their first stages, their first steps before birth, during the fetal period. Okay, and then at birth, there are about 200,000 to 2 million of these oocytes, these primary oocytes. Okay, so they're not done; they haven't gone through the process yet, but they're kind of committed. So that's what they're going to be, and that's a whole lot. That's way more than are, I guess, necessarily needed. And then some of those through the early years will be either reabsorbed, or you just get rid of them because you don't need that many. And about 400 or 40,000 remain at puberty. Okay, so this is at puberty. So these first steps started in the fetus, and then nothing. And then at puberty, now they can, each one at a time, usually, will start to develop into, and that's the follicular phase, will start to develop to become a mature oocyte, and ovulation will occur, and then it gets fertilized. Okay, so this process of meiosis actually, like I said, begins during the fetal period, doesn't do anything, and then each month it will continue its journey, and it actually doesn't complete its last stage of meiosis until after fertilization. Okay, so that's kind of interesting, and very different than, or not very different, but quite a bit different than how sperm are produced. And especially the fact that it starts early, and then it doesn't even stop. It doesn't even do its last step until after birth, or I'm sorry, after fertilization. Okay, so female reproductive system, it's a cyclic process, and this is where we're going to start talking now about what's going on in the ovaries versus what's going on in the uterus. So we're going to talk about these. Again, they happen simultaneously, but we're going to talk about them one at a time. So the ovarian cycle, this is where you're trying to get to the point of ovulation, where you release that egg into the fallopian tube. And that usually happens about once a month. So you release a mature oocyte about once a month. The uterine cycle, that's where you have the buildup of the endometrium in the uterus, and it builds up, it sloughs off, and then it builds up, it matures, starts to secrete, and then it will slough off, which is menses. So we're going to go through each one of those one at a time, starting with the ovarian cycle. Okay, so oocytes develop in the ovaries. So these eggs, these primary follicles, or these primary oocytes, are sitting down here. This 40,000 or so that you had at puberty are all sitting down here. This only shows 3 of them. And then they get a signal. Okay, so once a month, there's a signal from the anterior pituitary, and it releases a hormone called follicle stimulating hormone. And this follicle stimulating hormone stimulates these follicles to start developing. Okay, so you can see that the oocyte is just a dot, that's sitting inside this group of cells that we call a follicle. And so that develops over about 20, 24 days or something. And so that develops through the month and until it becomes, actually it's less than that for just development. It's about a couple of weeks. So about 12 days probably. And so that starts to develop, and then you have the oocyte that's ready to move out. Okay, so that's your follicular phase because it's a follicle. It is stimulated by follicle stimulating hormone to start developing. Okay, so one of these primary follicles will start to develop and then is released, the oocyte is released from that follicle. Okay, so that's the follicular phase, and then the actual release of the follicle, or the rupture of the follicle and the release of the oocyte is called ovulation. Okay, so ovulation is the second step, and then this follicle becomes what we call a corpus luteum. Corpus luteum stands for yellow body, and that's what happens is this follicle no longer has an oocyte, so the oocyte had moved out during ovulation, and so this follicle will then turn into something called the corpus luteum, and so we call this last part the luteal phase. Okay, so three different phases: follicular phase, development, ovulation, oocyte pops out, and then the luteal phase. Now I have a note here. So the actually ovulation, we're going to say something about this again, is caused by a surge in luteinizing hormone. If you remember talking about luteinizing hormone in males, luteinizing hormone stimulates Leydig cells. Well, in females, a surge of luteinizing hormone is what causes ovulation, and that kind of makes sense because once the oocyte leaves, you develop a corpus luteum. So that's why it's called the luteinizing hormone, because when it surges, then the next thing that you see is the corpus luteum. Okay, so if fertilization takes place, this corpus luteum, so if a sperm finds the egg, then this corpus luteum is going to hang around through the duration of the pregnancy. Okay? If there is no fertilization, then this corpus luteum, it'll wait a little while to find out if there's fertilization, but then it will deteriorate and your hormone levels will drop, and we'll talk about what that means for the uterus. That's when you have menses, and the endometrial lining will slough off. Okay? All right, so hormones are produced in the ovaries by the developing follicle. So if we go back to, if we look here, now we have a little graph of the ovarian cycle. And so this is the follicular phase here. You can see the developing oocyte. Okay, so FSH came down and said, okay, we need development of these follicles. The follicles started to develop, and they start to grow. And the cells, there's cells around it, they're called thecal cells. They will actually produce these hormones like estrogen and progesterone. So we can see that these hormone levels, estrogen and progesterone, this is estrogen, the first one, will start to increase as this follicle grows. Okay? And so we see progesterone. Progesterone usually remains pretty low, and then it will also start to increase before ovulation. But not as much as estrogen. So estrogen is your primary hormone prior to ovulation. And then progesterone, we can see after ovulation that progesterone is our major hormone. Okay, after ovulation. So remember that, because that's pretty simple. Estrogen prior, and then ovulation, and then progesterone kind of takes over. Okay, so as the follicle develops, more and more estrogen and progesterone are made, primarily prior to, or in the follicular phase. It's primarily estrogen, and then the corpus luteum develops. So remember, our follicle, after the egg popped out, turned into the corpus luteum, and the corpus luteum is going to produce more progesterone. Okay? Okay? And if pregnancy occurs, it will continue to produce, well, if pregnancy occurs, we'll see it'll continue to produce both estrogen and progesterone. Okay? But either way, progesterone is being produced during this luteal phase. All right, so we need to talk about some other details because we have to kind of put these hormones together. So we just mentioned that estrogen levels start to increase. So these cells surrounding the oocyte produce more and more estrogen. And estrogen, this is important when we start talking about how birth control works. When we have higher levels of estrogen, it will tell the anterior pituitary, it will say, okay, there's enough estrogen present, so you don't have to make as much of the LH and the FSH. Now hopefully we understand that from the endocrine system. That's just negative feedback. The more estrogen is being made, so there's no reason to make a lot more of the LH and FSH. It's already doing its job. It's going back. It's saying, yes, I'm here. And so the FSH and the LH really kind of have a fairly level amount. But then as the estrogen starts to increase, so we can see the estrogen starts to increase, a little bit less LH is made, and then, and this is so important, at some point, estrogen, instead of saying, hey, LH, I've got this, and FSH, instead of saying, I've got this, we don't need you anymore, suddenly estrogen becomes stimulatory to FSH. It switches to positive feedback, and it says, okay, estrogen levels have reached a certain level, okay, and usually there's a little bit of a dip there, but estrogen has reached a certain level, and so now it's going back and it's saying release tons of LH, tons of luteinizing hormone. Okay, and so that's where you have this what's called an LH surge. Okay, and this surge of luteinizing hormone, hugely important. The surge of luteinizing hormone is what causes ovulation. If you don't have that surge of luteinizing hormone, if these hormone levels are just kind of remaining constant, you never get the surge of luteinizing hormone. You will not have ovulation. And like I said, that's what hormonal birth control pills, or however you're getting them, that's what hormonal birth control depends on. It depends on keeping the estrogen and maybe progesterone levels, progesterone and maybe also estrogen levels constant. And so you never get the switch to positive feedback. The LH surge never takes place, and you never have ovulation. But that's what happens, okay? So estrogen begins to increase as a developing follicle matures. Normally, estrogen prevents LH from being released due to negative feedback, and at some point, the higher levels of estrogen actually cause more LH to be released. And so this is a switch. We call this a switch from negative feedback to positive feedback. And you have the surge of luteinizing hormone. Now, you also have a little bit of an uptick of follicle-stimulating hormone, but at the same time, inhibin is being released, and inhibin, if we remember this from males, remember the Sertoli cells were making sperm, and FSH was telling them to, but the Sertoli cells were kind of keeping FSH in check. It works the same in females. Inhibin kind of keeps the follicle-stimulating hormone in check. So it does increase a bit, but inhibin is not letting it surge as much as this luteinizing hormone. Okay, so the surge of luteinizing hormone induces ovulation, and it also causes the developing follicle after ovulation to create the corpus luteum. Okay, so it's really just a three-step process. We have the follicle developing, and then this LH surge and ovulation, and then we have the luteal phase, which you have the corpus luteum. And the corpus luteum, what it's going to do is it's going to start producing more progesterone. Okay. Now the progesterone is important because we're starting to look at this down here, this last little panel, whatever you want to call that. And you can see that all along in the uterus, all along, the endometrial lining has been building up. This lining of cells, blood vessels, has been building up on the uterine lining, ready to receive a fertilized egg. Okay? And then when the progesterone is released, it will cause this to develop even more, and it will cause it to become what we call secretory. So that means it's starting to produce some hormones and growth factors, things that help nurture the developing oocyte. So that's our question. We just went through the oocytes, or the ovarian cycle, and that's its three phases: the LH surge and all that stuff. And so now we're going to talk about what's happening in the uterus. Now, it's kind of interesting, and it makes perfect sense that when we start the uterine cycle, we call day 1 that point at which menses begins. That's when, and it kind of doesn't match up really with the ovarian cycle, but that's when the endometrium is shed, and we use that as the first day for a menstrual cycle. Because that's something that you can see. You can say, okay, when did you start your period? That's day 1. Okay, and then and so so we call that the beginning of the uterine cycle. So that's the first few days. We call it menses. And then after that has shed, well, it's time to develop that again. So we call that the proliferative phase. It proliferates and starts to develop again. Okay, so the endometrium, this layer here, proliferates and it starts to grow thicker, and then we have ovulation. So that's horribly written, but that's supposed to say ovulation. So we have ovulation, and then this, remember, the progesterone is being released, and that causes this endometrium to become secretory, and that's it's able to send signal molecules, growth factors, things like that to help the developing oocyte. Okay, so the uterine cycle largely controlled by hormones that are made in the ovaries. Okay, that makes sense. So estrogen, and I've mentioned this before, estrogen is primarily responsible for building up the endometrium. Okay, so for building it up to begin with, and then progesterone is primarily responsible for maintaining it, and it'll build it up a little bit more as well, but it maintains it and makes it secretory. And by secretory, I don't mean it keeps secrets. I mean that it's already written here. It secretes. Okay, so it secretes hormones and other growth factors and signal molecules to support that fertilizing oocyte. Because the oocyte, if it's fertilized, it has to know, it has to be able to survive there, obviously. Okay, so the menstrual cycle, again, the menses, it's about 28 to 30 days long. So menses is the first day of the cycle. Proliferative phase, and let's see. So here we go. So this is what you need to know. The proliferative phase, where it's building up, is about 10 days for most women, but that varies. Okay, so that amount of time from the end of menses to ovulation, so that's what we're talking about, the proliferative phase, is usually about 10 days. So then you have ovulation, and you begin the secretory phase, or sometimes called the luteal. Well, the luteal phase is what's actually going on in the ovaries. Okay, so the secretory phase coincides with the luteal phase of the ovary. Okay, but that lasts about 14 days, and that's pretty consistent for most women. Okay, so number 2, the proliferative phase can vary a little bit. It's about 10 days, but the secretory phase tends to be pretty consistent. That's right at 2 weeks. Okay. So let's see. So I want to add one more thing to this. It's pretty important, and I kind of talked about it here with the luteal phase. Is that menses, of course, is when the endometrial lining is being shed, and then we start the follicular phase in the ovary. Okay, so the beginning of the follicular phase of the ovary coincides with the proliferative phase in the uterus. Okay, so that's when that little oocyte, when it starts to develop, that FSH increases, it starts to develop, then that's where we start seeing the proliferation of the endometrium. Okay, and that kind of makes sense. Okay, and then ovulation and the luteal phase in the ovary is going to coincide with this secretory phase of the uterus. So I hope that kind of makes sense. We'll just kind of go through this again. Now, I didn't mention this much because we've already talked about it with males, but remember in the hypothalamus, so if we have, let's see, I don't have much room to write here, but if we have up here in the brain, there's this brain region called the hypothalamus, and that's what's releasing gonadotropin releasing hormone, GnRH. GnRH is going to send a signal to the anterior pituitary and tell the anterior pituitary to release follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone. Now, follicle stimulating hormone is going to do just that. It's going to stimulate the follicles that are in the ovary to start to develop, the follicular phase of the ovarian cycle. So these start to develop, estrogen secretion increases, and that's going to feed back and say, okay, yep, we've got estrogen. It's going to feed back to this FSH and LH and say, okay, stay level for a while. And then it switches, okay, getting close to ovulation after a few days, after a little over a week. Then it switches and it suddenly says, hey, LH, about that stay low thing that I was telling you, I want you now to release as much of you as you can, and that's the LH surge. Okay, the LH surge, and that is what then causes ovulation. Okay, so it switches to positive feedback, ovulation, and then that mature follicle that had just released the egg is now turns into or is transformed into the corpus luteum, yellow body, and then that will secrete progesterone. Okay. Progesterone triggers proliferation of the endometrial lining of the uterus, so the endometrium inside the uterus continues to develop somewhat and becomes secretory. Okay. And that's mainly progesterone that's causing that. Another thing that progesterone does that we haven't really talked that much about, remember that thick mucus, the thickening of the mucus? That is actually one of the things that progesterone will do. It causes the thickening of the mucus in the cervical canal, which effectively closes it off from not just sperm, but from anything else that's trying to move through that area. Okay, so if there's no implantation, the endometrium sloughs off. And when the endometrium sloughs off, LH and FSH, well, not only does the endometrium slough off, but that corpus luteum will start to disintegrate and it goes away. And so your estrogen levels will fall, your progesterone levels will fall, and the endometrium goes away, and any kind of feedback on LH and FSH go away, and so they start to increase again. And of course, when follicle stimulating hormone increases, it stimulates the next follicle, and you try again. Okay, so no implantation, endometrium sloughs off, LH and FSH increase again due to this decrease of estrogen and progesterone because the corpus luteum decayed or disintegrated, and FSH, LH increase, and you have the next cycle. Okay, so next we're going to talk about fertilization and the rest of this section.